Who gave you permission to sleep in this house?" The deep voice shattered the quiet morning before Grace Walker could even open her eyes. She stirred beneath a thick wool blanket, confused by the warmth surrounding her after the coldest night she had ever survived. Rain had finally stopped tapping against the weathered windows, and pale sunlight filtered through faded curtains that smelled faintly of cedar and wild lavender. For one peaceful moment, she forgot the endless miles she had walked through the forest, the empty stomach that had followed her for 2 days, and the loneliness that had become her closest companion. Then she slowly opened her eyes. 2 small children were curled against her sides, sleeping as peacefully as if they had known her forever. The little boy rested one tiny hand on her arm, while his younger sister held tightly to the edge of her sleeve with a contented smile. Grace froze. She had never seen these children before. Her heart began racing, not from fear of them, but from the realization that she had somehow wandered into someone's home. The previous evening returned to her memory in scattered pieces. A violent storm had swept across the mountains just before sunset. Cold wind had torn through the trees, soaking her simple linen dress until every step became heavier than the last. She had searched desperately for shelter before spotting a small stone cottage hidden beneath towering oak trees. The wooden door had been slightly open. She had called out several times, asking if anyone was there. Only silence answered. Believing the cottage had long been abandoned, she stepped inside only to escape the freezing rain. She never intended to stay longer than the storm. Exhaustion had stolen her strength before she even reached the fireplace. Now everything felt different. Fresh flowers rested inside a ceramic vase near the window. Tiny wooden toys lay neatly arranged beside a woven rug. A child's blanket had been carefully folded across an old rocking chair. This place was loved. Someone lived here. Before Grace could quietly slip away without waking the children, the cottage door slowly opened. Standing in the doorway was a tall man, with broad shoulders wrapped beneath a dark traveling cloak embroidered with silver thread. Rain still clung to his boots as morning light revealed sharp blue eyes filled with surprise rather than anger. Nathan Brooks, the Alpha King, had returned earlier than expected after several days inspecting villages near the northern border. He had intended only to collect a few personal belongings from the cottage before returning to the royal castle. Instead, he found an impossible sight. A young woman slept in the home that had belonged to his late wife, while his 2 pups rested peacefully against her as though she had always belonged there. His breath caught in his chest. Since losing their mother, neither child had willingly slept beside another person. Servants had tried. Tutors had tried. Even Nathan himself often found them waking from troubled dreams before dawn. Yet this complete stranger had unknowingly given them the first peaceful morning they had experienced in years. Grace immediately rose from the bed, carefully making certain neither child was disturbed. She lowered her eyes respectfully. "I am so sorry," she whispered with quiet sincerity. "I believe this cottage was empty. I only needed shelter from the storm. I never meant to intrude." Nathan studied her carefully. Her clothes were worn from long travel, yet clean despite the muddy roads. Her hands carried small scratches from gathering firewood, but there was dignity in the way she stood. She did not beg. She did not invent excuses. She simply accepted responsibility. Before Nathan could answer, the little boy slowly opened his eyes, looked first at Grace, then at his father, and smiled more brightly than Nathan had seen since the day his wife was still alive. The little boy climbed from the bed before Nathan could speak and wrapped both arms around Grace as though greeting an old friend instead of a stranger. His younger sister rubbed the sleep from her eyes, noticed Grace standing beside the bed, and reached for her hand without the slightest hesitation. Nathan remained completely still. The sight before him made no sense. For 3 long years, ever since the passing of their mother, his pups had hidden behind silence. They rarely smiled at visitors, never trusted unfamiliar faces, and often refused even the gentle attention of the castle servants who had cared for them since infancy. Yet within a single night, this unknown young woman had somehow given them a sense of peace that no one else had been able to restore. Grace looked down with quiet uncertainty, afraid even the smallest movement might frighten the children. Instead, the little girl smiled brightly. "Will you stay for breakfast?" she asked with innocent hope. Grace felt her heart tighten. She knelt slowly so she could meet the child's eyes. I do not think this is my home, she answered softly. I should thank your father for his kindness and continue on my journey. The little boy immediately shook his head. Please do not leave yet. Nathan finally stepped farther into the cottage. His expression remained calm, although countless questions filled his mind. He had expected to find an empty house preserved only by memories. Instead, warmth had quietly returned to rooms that had long been untouched by laughter. The morning sunlight danced across polished wooden floors. The fireplace had been cleaned. Fresh water rested inside a kettle above glowing coals that Grace must have carefully prepared before dawn. Nothing had been taken. Nothing had been disturbed beyond simple acts of care. She had treated the cottage with the same respect someone would offer a sacred place without ever knowing its history. Grace lowered her eyes once again. Your Majesty, I truly believed no one lived here. I only wish to escape the storm for one night. I will leave immediately if that is your command. Nathan noticed that she spoke without fear or desperation. She did not plead for mercy. She simply accepted whatever decision awaited her. Before he could answer, the little girl gently tugged on Grace's sleeve. Papa, she said with complete sincerity. She smiled at us before she knew who we were. Nathan looked at his daughter in silence. Children often notice truths adults overlooked. Grace had shown kindness without expecting reward, without recognizing titles, wealth, or power. She had simply seen two lonely children. Outside, several royal guards approached the cottage after noticing their king had not returned. Nathan raised one hand before they reached the doorway, silently instructing them to remain outside. He did not wish to disturb the unusual peace filling the little home. Grace noticed the gesture, but said nothing. The little boy suddenly disappeared into another room and returned carrying a faded wooden horse. Mama made this for me, he whispered before carefully placing it into Grace's hands. Nathan felt time seem to stop. His son had never allowed anyone else to touch that treasured keepsake. Grace accepted it with both hands, holding it as carefully as though it were the finest treasure in the kingdom. She smiled gently. Your mother must have loved you very much. The little boy nodded before taking her hand once more. Nathan watched the quiet exchange, realizing something impossible had begun inside the cottage. The children had chosen to trust Grace long before he had even decided whether she should stay another hour. Grace carefully returned the small wooden horse to the little boy, making certain his tiny fingers had a secure grip before releasing it. His smile grew even brighter, and his younger sister slipped her hand into Grace's as naturally as though they had known each other for years. Nathan watched the quiet moment with growing uncertainty. Every instinct told him to ask the stranger to leave, yet every glance toward his children reminded him that doing so would almost certainly erase the happiest morning they had experienced since their mother's passing. Grace sensed the difficult decision resting silently between them. She offered a respectful bow. Your Majesty, I have already caused enough trouble. Please allow me to leave before I burden your family any longer. She turned toward the cottage door, determined not to overstay the kindness she had accidentally received. Before she could reach the entrance, the little girl suddenly wrapped both arms around Grace's waist. Please do not go, she whispered. The little boy hurried beside his sister and held Grace's sleeve with surprising determination. You promised nothing, he said softly, but it feels warm when you are here. Nathan had never seen his children cling to anyone except their mother. Even after years of patient care from trusted servants, they had always kept a careful distance. Now they stood together as if afraid this gentle stranger might disappear forever. Grace slowly knelt once more, her voice filled with kindness rather than false reassurance. Sometimes people must continue their journeys, she said, but I will always be grateful that I met both of you. Tears gathered in the little girl's eyes. Nathan felt something inside his heart tighten. He had spent years trying to protect his children from more sorrow, yet this unexpected farewell threatened to bring fresh sadness into their lives. Outside the cottage, several royal attendants quietly waited for their king's instructions. None dared interrupt the silence. Nathan finally spoke. Grace Walker. She looked up immediately. Yes, Your Majesty. Where were you traveling before the storm? She hesitated for only a moment. Nowhere that truly belongs to me. The answer carried no bitterness, only quiet honesty. I left the village where I was raised because there was no future waiting for me there. I hoped another place might allow me to earn an honest living. Nathan noticed she never asked for charity. She spoke only of work, dignity, and the chance to stand on her own feet. The qualities reminded him of someone he had loved deeply many years before. Grace gently freed herself from the children's embrace and reached for the simple satchel resting beside the fireplace. It contained everything she owned. As she lifted it onto her shoulder, the little boy suddenly ran outside without saying a word. Nathan frowned in confusion until he realized the child was heading toward the narrow forest path leading away from the cottage. The little girl quickly followed her brother. Grace immediately hurried after them, worried they might become lost among the towering trees. Nathan stepped outside just in time to hear his son call back with surprising determination. "If Grace leaves, then we are going too." The morning breeze carried the child's words across the quiet clearing. Nathan stood motionless as he watched his children refuse to return. For the first time in years, they were not running away from fear. They were running after hope, and he realized with growing disbelief that everything inside his carefully guarded world had begun to change because one exhausted Omega had simply fallen asleep inside a forgotten cottage. Grace reached the children just before they disappeared beneath the towering oak trees. She knelt beside them, brushing a few loose leaves from the little girl's hair before offering a gentle smile. "Running away will only make your father worry," she said softly. "The people who love us deserve our honesty." The little boy lowered his eyes, still holding the faded wooden horse against his chest. "We only wanted you to stay," he admitted. Grace rested one hand lightly on his shoulder. Wanting someone to stay is different from asking them to lose their own path. Nathan had quietly followed them through the clearing, stopping only a few feet away. Watching Grace comfort his children instead of encouraging their rebellion stirred emotions he had carefully buried beneath years of responsibility. She could have used their affection to secure a place for herself, yet she chose to teach them respect instead. The morning breeze carried the scent of fresh pine through the forest as birds gradually returned after the storm. Nathan finally spoke in a calm voice. "Return to the cottage." The children looked toward him with uncertain expressions. "All of us," he added. Relief spread across Grace's face, not because she believed she had been accepted, but because the tension surrounding the children had begun to fade. They walked back together beneath the quiet canopy of trees, and once inside the cottage, Grace immediately reached for her satchel. "Your Majesty, thank you for allowing me to explain myself. I will leave now that the children are safe." Nathan looked around the small home before answering. During the short time they had been outside, sunlight had filled every corner of the cottage. The polished table reflected the warm light from the windows. Fresh rainwater collected inside a wooden barrel near the doorway. Even the wildflowers Grace had gathered the previous evening brightened the room with simple color. None of it appeared planned. She had simply cared for whatever was placed before her. "You said you were searching for honest work," Nathan said after a long silence. Grace nodded. "Yes, Your Majesty." "Then remain here until tomorrow morning." Surprise crossed her face. "Only until tomorrow," Nathan continued before she could misunderstand his intention. The storm washed out several bridges leading toward the nearest village. Traveling alone today would be unsafe. "You may stay as a guest until the roads are clear." Grace hesitated, knowing how easily kindness could become an unwanted burden. "I do not wish to inconvenience anyone." Before Nathan could respond, the little girl smiled brightly. "You are not an inconvenience." The little boy eagerly pointed toward the neglected flower beds outside the window. "Will you help us fix the garden after breakfast?" Grace looked toward Nathan, waiting for his approval instead of answering immediately. He noticed the quiet respect in that single glance. She never assumed she belonged here. She always waited to be invited. Nathan gave a slight nod. "If you wish." A grateful smile appeared across Grace's face as she accepted the simple invitation. After breakfast, she stepped into the overgrown garden with the children, gently removing weeds, straightening broken wooden borders, and tying climbing roses back onto their weathered trellis. She had never seen this cottage before the previous evening, yet every choice she made seemed strangely familiar. Standing silently beneath the porch roof, Nathan watched as forgotten beauty slowly returned to the garden, and for reasons he could not explain, each quiet movement reminded him of mornings that he believed had been lost forever. The afternoon sun settled gently over the cottage as laughter drifted through the garden for the first time in years. Grace worked quietly beside the two pups, showing them how to loosen the soil around the rose bushes without damaging the roots. The little girl proudly carried a small wooden bucket filled with fresh water from the nearby well, while her brother carefully gathered fallen branches to clear the narrow stone path. None of the tasks were difficult, yet every accomplishment brought delighted smiles that seemed brighter than the morning itself. Nathan remained near the porch, reviewing reports delivered by his royal attendants, but his attention wandered back toward the garden again and again. He noticed how naturally Grace encouraged the children instead of correcting every mistake. When the little boy accidentally spilled half the water onto the grass, she simply laughed softly and handed him the bucket again. "Flowers are patient," she said kindly. "We can always bring them a little more." The boy grinned with visible relief before hurrying back toward the well. Nathan quietly folded the reports in his hands. For years, every tutor had focused on discipline, lessons, and perfect manners, believing structure would heal the children's sadness. Grace had offered something entirely different. She gave them room to breathe. As the afternoon continued, the little girl discovered several unopened flower buds hidden beneath tangled vines. "They were waiting," Grace said with a warm smile. "Sometimes beautiful things only need someone to notice them." Nathan looked toward the climbing roses and unexpectedly remembered hearing almost those exact words many years earlier from his late wife, while they had planted the same garden together. The memory arrived so suddenly that he instinctively closed his eyes. When he opened them again, Grace was kneeling beside the children, completely unaware that she had awakened a forgotten piece of his past. There was no imitation in her actions, no attempt to replace someone she had never met. She simply followed her own compassionate instincts. As evening approached, Grace prepared a simple meal, using vegetables growing beside the cottage and fresh bread that one of the royal attendants respectfully offered after receiving Nathan's quiet approval. Before serving anyone else, Grace placed the smallest portions onto the children's plates first. She did not realize Nathan had noticed. It was another small habit that reflected quiet generosity rather than obligation. During dinner, the little girl asked Grace to tell a story about the stars. Grace smiled gently before looking through the cottage window toward the darkening sky. She spoke about travelers finding hope beneath familiar constellations, about every long journey eventually leading someone home, and about courage sometimes appearing in the form of simple kindness instead of great victories. The children listened with complete attention until both gradually leaned against her shoulders, their eyes growing heavy with sleep. Nathan watched in silence. His son had not fallen asleep so peacefully while listening to a bedtime story since his mother's gentle voice had disappeared from the cottage. The quiet room felt warmer than it had in years. Just as Nathan began believing the evening could not surprise him further, the elderly royal housekeeper stepped through the open doorway. She looked around the restored cottage, the blooming garden outside, and the sleeping children before her eyes slowly widened with disbelief. In a voice barely above a whisper, she looked toward Nathan and said, "Your Majesty, this is exactly how Her Majesty used to spend every summer afternoon here." The elderly housekeeper slowly stepped farther into the cottage, her eyes moving from the restored garden outside the window to the freshly cleaned kitchen and finally to Grace, who carefully adjusted the blanket covering the sleeping children. Nathan remained silent, waiting for the woman to explain the surprise written across her face. She had served the royal family for decades and rarely reacted so openly. After a long moment, she smiled with gentle sadness. Every spring, Her Majesty would open every window before sunset so the scent of the roses could drift inside, she said quietly. She always believed a home should breathe with the garden. Grace looked around with visible confusion. "I only thought the fresh air would help the cottage feel less closed after the storm," she answered honestly. The housekeeper's expression softened even more. She also arranged wildflowers in that very vase beside the window, never expensive flowers from the palace gardens. Grace glanced toward the small bouquet she had gathered that morning and lowered her eyes. "I did not know." Nathan listened without interrupting. Every small detail seemed impossible. Grace had never met his late wife, had never visited this cottage before the storm, and yet her simple choices echoed memories that Nathan believed only he still carried. There was no imitation in her actions because there had been nothing for her to imitate. She simply followed the quiet kindness that came naturally to her heart. The children remained peacefully asleep beside the fireplace, something that had become almost unheard of in recent years. The housekeeper approached Nathan and spoke softly enough that only he could hear. "Your Majesty, I have watched many people try to comfort the young ones. None ever reached them. This young woman asked for nothing, expected nothing, and somehow gave them exactly what they needed." Nathan looked toward Grace again. She was gently folding the children's small cloaks so they would be ready when they awoke, completely unaware that anyone was observing her. She moved through the cottage as though caring for ordinary tasks was simply part of who she was. There was no performance, no effort to impress the king, only quiet thoughtfulness in every motion. As evening shadows stretched across the wooden floor, the housekeeper walked toward an old cabinet tucked into the corner of the room. She hesitated before opening its weathered door. Inside rested a small wooden box covered with delicate carvings of climbing roses. Nathan recognized it immediately. His late wife had kept personal letters inside, and after her passing he had never found the strength to open the box again. The housekeeper carefully lifted it into her hands and turned toward him. "I cleaned this cottage many times after Her Majesty left us," she said. "One letter remained unopened because she instructed that only you should read it if the right day ever arrived." Nathan accepted the box with trembling hands, surprised that he had forgotten its existence. A thin envelope rested inside, still sealed with faded royal wax. Across the front, written in his late wife's graceful handwriting, were only a few simple words. "For the day our children laugh here again." Nathan stared at the envelope without moving. Behind him, Grace quietly smiled as the little girl stirred in her sleep and instinctively reached for her hand. Grace gently held the tiny fingers without knowing what the letter said, while Nathan slowly realized that the day described years ago had finally arrived, and somehow it had begun with a stranger seeking nothing more than shelter from a storm. The cottage remained silent long after the children had fallen asleep, but Nathan could not bring himself to break the seal on the letter. He turned the faded envelope over in his hands, tracing the familiar handwriting with his thumb before carefully placing it back inside the carved wooden box. Some memories deserve to be opened only when the heart was finally ready to receive them. Grace quietly noticed the struggle in his eyes without asking a single question. She had learned long ago that grief often needed companionship more than conversation. The elderly housekeeper gently carried the sleeping little girl to the small bedroom, while Nathan lifted his son into his arms. Even asleep, the boy instinctively reached toward Grace for just a brief moment before resting peacefully against his father's shoulder. Nathan noticed the movement, and instead of feeling replaced, he felt something unexpected. His son no longer looked afraid. After the children were tucked into bed, Grace quietly gathered the empty bowls from dinner and began washing them beside the small kitchen window. Nathan stepped closer. "You are our guest," he said calmly. "You do not need to do this." Grace smiled without looking up from the warm water. "A home that feeds me deserves clean dishes in return." Her answer was so simple that Nathan could not find another response. She never spoke in hopes of impressing anyone. Every word reflected the quiet principles by which she lived. Outside, evening clouds slowly gathered once again, carrying the promise of another gentle rain before dawn. Nathan looked through the window toward the restored garden. The climbing roses stood neatly tied along the weathered trellis, and the narrow stone path was visible for the first time in years. It felt as though the cottage itself had awakened after a long sleep. "Tomorrow the bridges will likely be repaired," Nathan said after a long silence. Grace nodded softly. "Then I will continue my journey." Nathan expected the words to sound reasonable. Instead, an unfamiliar heaviness settled over the room. Before either of them spoke again, hurried footsteps approached from outside. One of the royal guards respectfully stopped at the doorway and bowed. "Your Majesty, the royal carriage has arrived from the castle. Several members of the council request your immediate return before tomorrow's assembly." Nathan acknowledged the message with a slight nod. "Prepare the carriage." The guard bowed once more before leaving. Grace quietly dried her hands and reached for her worn satchel resting beside the fireplace. "Then I should leave before sunrise," she said gently. "It will be easier for everyone." Nathan looked toward her but remained silent. He understood why she wished to avoid becoming the subject of court gossip or unnecessary attention. Yet something inside him resisted allowing her to disappear as unexpectedly as she had arrived. Early the next morning, golden sunlight poured across the meadow surrounding the cottage. The royal carriage waited outside, its polished crest shining beneath the clear sky. Grace stepped onto the front porch carrying her small satchel, prepared to thank everyone one final time before quietly walking toward the nearest village. Suddenly, the cottage door burst open behind her. The little boy raced outside, followed closely by his younger sister. Without hesitation, both children ran straight past the waiting carriage and stood in front of Grace, each taking one of her hands. They faced their father together with remarkable courage despite their small size. The little boy lifted his chin and spoke with complete certainty. "If Grace is leaving, then we want to go wherever she goes." Nathan stood beside the carriage, looking at the three figures before him, and realized the decision waiting for him was no longer only about a stranger who had wandered into an old cottage. It had quietly become a choice that would shape the future of his family. Grace gently squeezed the children's hands before slowly kneeling so she could look into their eyes. "You belong with your father," she said softly. "Love does not ask us to leave the people who need us most." The little girl shook her head, her eyes already glistening with tears. "We need you too." The simple words settled over the quiet meadow like the morning sunlight. Nathan stood motionless beside the royal carriage, watching the children express feelings they had hidden from the world for years. They were no longer frightened, withdrawn, or trapped inside their grief. Somehow, in only 2 days, Grace had reminded them that opening their hearts did not mean forgetting their mother. It meant allowing happiness to return without guilt. Nathan slowly walked toward them until he stood only a few feet away. Grace respectfully lowered her eyes once again, believing he had come to end the impossible chapter that had begun with the storm. Instead, Nathan spoke with calm certainty. "Grace Walker, I asked where your journey was leading, and you told me nowhere that truly belonged to you." She nodded quietly. That was the truth. Nathan glanced at his children before looking back at her. "Perhaps you simply had not reached the right destination yet." Grace looked up in surprise, uncertain she had understood his meaning. Before she could answer, the elderly housekeeper stepped onto the porch carrying the carved wooden box that contained the unopened letter. She offered it to Nathan with gentle encouragement. After a long breath, he finally broke the faded royal seal. The paper inside had yellowed with time, but the handwriting remained graceful and clear. Nathan silently read the first few lines before emotion softened his expression. He closed his eyes for a brief moment, then carefully folded the letter again. Grace made no attempt to ask what it said. Some memories deserved privacy. Nathan looked toward the restored garden, where roses now climbed neatly across the wooden trellis once more. "My wife wrote this many years ago," he said quietly. "She believed that one day our children would laugh here again. She asked me that when the day finally came, I should never let fear drive away the person who brought that joy back into their lives." Grace's eyes widened with quiet disbelief. "Your Majesty, I never intended to change anything here." Nathan gave a faint smile, one filled with gratitude rather than sorrow. "That is exactly why you did." The little boy stepped closer to his father. "Does that mean Grace can stay?" Nathan looked at both children before answering. "It means I would like to ask Grace a different question." He turned fully toward her. "The royal castle has many servants, tutors, and advisors, but it has been missing something far more important for a very long time. I cannot ask you to become someone you are not, and I will never ask you to replace the memory of anyone. But if you are willing, I would like to offer you a place where your kindness is welcomed instead of overlooked." Grace stood speechless, her fingers tightening gently around the strap of her worn satchel. She had spent years believing she was only passing through the lives of others, never truly belonging anywhere. Now the most powerful man in the kingdom was offering her not wealth or status, but something she had almost forgotten how to hope for. A place where her compassion mattered. Before Grace could gather the words to answer, the little girl smiled through joyful tears and whispered, "I think home finally found us." Grace remained silent for several long moments as the morning breeze gently carried the fragrance of blooming roses across the cottage garden. She looked at the children, then toward Nathan, before quietly lowering her eyes. "Your Majesty," she said with calm sincerity, "I have never wished to become someone else's place in a family. If I accept your kindness, it must be because I am allowed to remain myself. Nathan stepped closer, his expression steady and warm. That is exactly what I am asking. My children already have a mother whose memory will always be honored. I am not searching for someone to replace her. I am asking whether you would allow us the chance to build new memories beside the old ones. Grace felt tears gathering in her eyes, not from sadness, but from the unfamiliar feeling of being accepted without needing to become anyone else. She smiled gently and nodded. Then I would be honored to stay. Before another word could be spoken, the little boy laughed with pure excitement and threw his arms around Grace once again. His younger sister quickly joined him, and the three of them stood together as sunlight poured across the quiet meadow. Even the royal attendants waiting beside the carriage exchanged small smiles after witnessing the joyful moment. During the journey back to the castle, the children insisted that Grace ride beside them instead of following in another carriage. They eagerly pointed toward rivers, forests, and distant hills, sharing stories only children could tell with complete wonder. Nathan watched from across the carriage, noticing that Grace never interrupted them or pretended to know everything. She simply listened with genuine interest, making each child feel heard. When the towering castle finally appeared beyond the rolling hills, Grace felt a brief wave of uncertainty. She had never imagined walking through such magnificent gates. Nathan noticed her hesitation and quietly said, "A home is not measured by its walls. It is measured by the people who welcome you inside." As they entered the castle courtyard, servants and advisors respectfully bowed to their king. Many looked curiously toward the unfamiliar young Omega traveling beside the royal family. Yet Nathan offered no explanation beyond the confidence of his own actions. The children happily took Grace by the hands and led her through the great hall, as though introducing the castle to an old friend rather than a newcomer. Over the weeks that followed, the quiet changes became impossible to ignore. The children laughed more often. They explored the gardens again, filled the library with bedtime stories, and greeted each morning with eager smiles instead of silence. The castle itself seemed brighter because joy had returned to its halls. Grace never sought attention or recognition. She continued helping wherever she was needed, treating every servant, guard, and guest with the same quiet respect she had shown inside the little cottage. Nathan gradually found himself smiling more easily, no longer burdened by the fear that moving forward meant leaving the past behind. One peaceful afternoon, they returned together to the small cottage where everything had begun. The roses bloomed more beautifully than ever, filling the air with familiar sweetness. Nathan removed a small iron key from his cloak and placed it gently into Grace's hands. "This cottage once carried only memories," he said softly. "Now it carries hope as well. Wherever kindness is welcomed, a family can begin again." Grace looked around the peaceful garden where laughter echoed beneath the old oak trees, then smiled as the children ran ahead along the stone path. She finally understood that she had not stumbled into someone else's story during the storm. She had quietly become part of its next chapter, proving that the strongest hearts are not the ones that never break, but the ones brave enough to open again when kindness finally finds its way home.